can we agree, or at least I'd love to hear your perspective on this, that Israel's actions since October the 7th, from how they've retaliated against Gaza and against Hamas, as you mentioned, there's probably around 19,000 casualties at this point, 20,000 casualties at this point. Can we agree that at worst, that's a genocide, and at best, that's an army that doesn't care enough about Palestinian lives? Destiny.
Are we saying that because of the October 7th, or I'm sorry, because of the incursions into Gaza, Israel doesn't care about Palestinian lives? Is that essentially the question?
No, the question of how they've reacted since then, of all the civilian casualties have been. I mean, even for example, they killed accidentally 3 hostages of their own hostages. I mean, doesn't that say something?
I mean, what does it say? I think
who are holding white flags.
So here are issues that I have with Israel and the IDF, okay? One, here are some broad issues, and then I'll focus it more into Gaza, okay? So one is settler violence seems to be really hard for the IDF to account for in the West Bank, okay? There are settlers that will kill people in the West Bank, that will kill Palestinians, that either it goes unanswered or the punishments are suspect, as in they probably should be higher. And then you also see a lot of antagonism towards people in the West Bank, including from the IDF. These are bad things that need to be rectified. Okay, when you look in the West Bank. When you look in the Gaza Strip, the civilian casualty count is high, and there are actions that happen that I think we should ask questions about. So my understanding is, I don't think anything else has come out, for those 3 hostages that came out, they were shirtless and they were waving a white flag on a stick, okay? How these 3 people end up getting killed by the IDF, not only is that unacceptable, obviously, should also make you question, well, if that happened and those were hostages, have there been other instances of the IDF shooting people that also were presenting similarly in conditions where they were clearly or obviously not a threat? That being said, while these incidents do happen and they're horrible, something that we need to keep in mind is that we have an unprecedented view into the day-to-day ongoings of military conflict that we have never had in the past. I am sure that we've seen it happen on the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, where civilians or soldiers that seem to have surrendered or that aren't threats are being killed, either by drones, either by soldiers, either by grenades. We are having an unprecedented look into military conflict on the day-to-day. To assume that this is like magnitudes worse than ever it has been, or that military conflict was historically, is probably not true. That doesn't excuse any of the actions, of course. It should always come under review. There should be other people that are investigating potential war crimes, whether that's Israel being forced to evaluate or third-party people like Amnesty International or the UN Human Rights Watch evaluating it. Like all of these things, I think the more eyes on this, the better. Okay, 1, 2. However, a couple other things. One, I don't like the term indiscriminate killing because, one, if it was truly indiscriminate and there were truly carpet bombing runs, Dresden saw 50,000 people evaporated in like 24 hours, okay? The Tokyo bombing saw more people disintegrated than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined when it came to bombing. That's what indiscriminate bombing looks like, and both of those areas were far less densely populated than the Gaza Strip. We need to be asking questions about how do we deal with Hamas in a way that limits civilian casualties, but doesn't just let Hamas get off scot-free? That cannot be the answer. I agree that the civilian casualty count is high. Even if I accept that Israel is saying it is killing Hamas terrorists, I think they've said, 5,000? That still leaves 10,000 plus civilians that have been killed by Israeli munitions. It's not good, but the answer cannot be ceasefire, 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 where Hamas remains in power. That's unbelievably unacceptable, and I think it shows an insane inability to empathize with the Israeli side here that just got essentially 9/11, a month and a half ago.
Oh, wait, so let me actually push you on the question I actually asked. Do you think Israel care enough about Palestinian lives?
Do I think they care enough about them? I would lean like 51-49 yes. The issue is that I don't have insight into the decisions that are being made in Israeli command when it comes to choosing targets. It could be the case that tomorrow, let's say a huge commission is ran and you find out that the IDF is looking at a target and they're saying, there was a Hamas in here 7 days ago, let's f***ing bomb it. And they blow up an entire apartment complex and 40, 50, 60 civilians die. That's not acceptable. It could be the case that we see in a lot of targets, there's Hamas operating out of here, we've dropped leaflets, we know that they use this for command, we've done everything we can, we were gonna bomb it, they bomb it, 20, 30 civilians are killed. I'd say in that sense, they did essentially what they could. I don't know what the alternatives here are. I'd love to hear them if there are any, because it seems like the only thing people say is ceasefire and peace, which cannot happen with Hamas. So yeah, I would lean towards, just on the numbers that I've seen so far and everything, it seems like Israel is considering civilian casualties, as much as people want to say they aren't, but I can't truly give you an honest answer to that without understanding the decisions that are being made within the Israeli military, because that could go either way.
Cenk, there's a lot to respond to.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the earlier question just for 1 second, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I actually agree with Destiny that the Palestinians should reject terrorism. I don't think it's a moral or productive pathway to peace. I don't think it's the right way to go at all. The reason I object is because I don't want Palestinians characterized as some sort of violent, savage terrorist wherever they go, like as if it's just out of whole cloth. There's nothing we could do about them. We just have to occupy them forever because of these violent savages. No, they're fighting back in a way that is counterproductive and not the right way to fight back. But I can understand why. And I think any human being, and it seems like even Destiny can understand why you would fight back if you were under occupation or someone took your land, your home, etc. And the Palestinian Authority, and this is going to come back to this question at the end, did actually do the right path. They went to the UN and asked for a state just like Israel did. And Israel called it terrorism, because Israel calls everything terrorism, even if the most diplomatic, peaceful path there is. And Netanyahu was screaming bloody murder about it. Anti-Semitic, terror. It makes no sense at all. And they do it anyway because he doesn't want peace. And he said it many times, and now the Israeli ambassadors are saying it publicly. They don't want peace. They just want to grab that land. The occupation is not an accident for 56 years. It's because they wanted to do it. Okay, so now on to the question of how they've been acting since October 7th in their destruction of Gaza. So this is not like, oh my God, we were trying to avoid civilian casualties, but golly gee, the IDF has the worst aim in the world. It's just a totally incompetent military that accidentally kills tens of thousands of civilians. No, they're dropping 2,000. Let's talk facts. They're dropping 2,000-pound bombs. The U.S. never dropped a bomb larger than 500 pounds in the worst fighting in Iraq, because in residential areas, we determined, as much as, although our invasion of Iraq was awful and horrific and hundreds of thousands of civilians died eventually through the conflict and killings on both sides. But even in that horrific situation, we thought, well, you can't go more than 500 pounds in a residential area. That's just indiscriminate murder of civilians. Israel's going 2,000-pound bombs on top of residential buildings. Now, New York Times just had a story about how a lot of the bombs that they're dropping, nearly half, about 45%, are what's called dumb bombs. They're not even precision guided. They're just dropping them in the middle of a residential city, and they're barely aiming. And then the third fact is that we've seen that because of the IDF videos, the tunnels that Hamas has, it looks like they are largely totally intact. And even Netanyahu in an interview said, once we started the ground invasion, we finally started to do some damage to Hamas. Oh, so the 29,000 bombs that you dropped in an area the size of Las Vegas, you basically just implied and admitted that they didn't work at all in getting Hamas. Hamas is in the tunnels are totally unaffected. And you knew that. But they're still dropping bombs on civilians. And so now they not only have they killed now at a bare minimum about 10 to 15 times the number of civilians that Hamas did, making them 10 to 15 times worse terrorists. Let's be clear about our definitions. If you murder civilians and you're a Palestinian, you're called a terrorist. When you murder civilians and you're Israel, you're called a wonderful ally and a democratic nation who just keeps missing with all their 2,000-pound bombs as they dropped 29,000 of them. No, they're murdering civilians. Every bomb dropped on Gaza is an act of terrorism. No ands, ifs, or buts. But even if you take the ridiculous, absurd IDF numbers, and everyone knows that IDF, almost every statement they put out is propaganda. They're in the middle of war. I get it. Both sides do propaganda. But if you take their outlandish number of 5,000, they've shown almost no Hamas fighters. They showed like one pair of boots and a couple of flak jackets. They have all of the capability of showing evidence, pictures, videos, etc. They've shown almost no dead Hamas fighters. But okay, let's say the 5,000 is real. It's hilarious, totally not. But okay, even if you granted that, over 19,000 dead now. When Hamas invaded Israel on October 7th, all the things they did were horrific, but they killed about 373 soldiers, and the rest, about 800 or so, were civilians. And I condemn that incredibly forcefully, definitely the wrong way to go, definitely immoral, definitely terrible. But Hamas's ratio is still better than Israel's ratio, let alone the raw numbers. So if Israel is killing 10 to 20 times more civilians, and their ratio of civilians to Hamas fighters, even by the best numbers that they give, is still worse than Hamas, well, who's the bigger terrorist? I actually don't think that there's any factual question about that at all. There might be an emotional reaction you have. No way. I love Israel. They can't be terrorists. I hate the Palestinians. They're obviously terrorists. But the numbers indicate that Israel is doing far more terrorism. And by the way, they're doing far more terrorism against the people they occupy and oppress already. Okay, whereas the Palestinians are fighting back in a misguided way, but that's the reality of the situation. And this whole idea of Hamas remains, so we have to keep murdering Palestinian civilians. And we, guys, again, we have eyes. We can see the babies. We can see their body parts being pulled out of the rubble. We can see that 9,000 children have died. My heart broke, and I was very adamant on air about how terrible the Hamas attack was on October 7th. My heart broke for those 37 kids killed in Israel. 36 kids killed in Israel. 9,000 kids killed in Gaza. The idea that Israel is not doing terrorism, that Israel is not the oppressor, that Israel is not being absurdly brutal in their destruction of Gaza just doesn't pass any sanity test, because the whole world can see Gaza is absolutely destroyed and their civilians are being butchered. We all got eyes. We all have ears.